What on earth is a military rapier? And rapiers can't cut. Well, rapiers can cut. Let's talk about this. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I'm going to try and keep this as brief as I can. First of all, you will find the term military rapier used in various sources online and very occasionally in books, although it's not a very academic term. What on earth is a military rapier? Well, to answer that, we also have come to this question of can rapiers cut or can they not cut? And I've been a proponent of describing rapiers as thrust-centric swords, okay? And some people have got their knickers in a twist because they have heard me say that rapiers don't cut very well. Well, it depends on the rapier, but let's be honest about it. Rapiers tend not to cut very well compared to something like a falchion or a broadsword or a longsword. Maybe let's come back to that in a second. But fundamentally, rapier is an incredibly vague term. Okay, and my friend David Rawlings over at London Longsword Academy, he makes the point that in most period rapier treatises they refer to it simply as a sword. Okay, so a sword is a sword, and equally I would add, and he would say, and anybody else specialised in rapier sources would say, the fact is that rapiers in rapier treatises from the period where they're teaching you how to use these swords, they thrust and they cut. Yes, indeed, the thrust is usually the predominant attack, but pretty much all rapier treatises have some degree of cutting in them, usually with a circular rotational movement, so you have to give some degree of motion and power to the blow in order to cut with it. This incidentally is an original English rapier from about 1630, 1640, so it is absolutely original one, and yes indeed this could cut. You will notice that it has a relatively thin, the cutting portion of the blade, lenticular section blade, and it is very, very narrow, so you're not going to cleave through clothing, you're not going to chop limbs off in the way that you might do with a falchion or a sabre or a backsword or something like this. But nevertheless, a cut like that to your face, your neck, your fingers, your forearm, your thigh, will have a very useful effect at causing pain, causing wounds, possibly even severing arteries and things like possibly tendons and things like this. So the fact is that although this is a very narrow blade and it is very much, this is a weapon which is specialised to thrusting, it does have some cutting capacity. However, I have made this point in the past and I want to make it again here briefly. Some rapier blades literally cannot cut. Now, I feel that there's been people pushing back against one particular misconception. They often go too far. And the simple fact is, if you go to the Wallace Collection or the Royal Armouries or the Stibbett Museum or these various places that have lots of rapiers and you look at them, you'll see there's a huge variety of the blades. And some of the blades will not cut, and so this is actually an earlier rapier blade mounted on a slightly later small sword hilt. So the small sword hilt probably dates to about maybe 1720, 1740, something like that, and the blade is probably from the late 1600s and was probably originally married to an earlier transitional rapier blade. And this is, I can tell you, from well, basically almost all of the blade, it's basically square. It's like a very slightly flattened square. Does it have edges? Technically, yes. Are you going to be able to cut anything with those edges? No. And there are lots of swords of different nationalities, Italian, Spanish, English, that fall into this category. Some rapiers cannot really cut because they don't have the edge geometry that quite simply, carefully put that down, quite simply it's to do with thickness relative to width. So as the blade gets narrower, if you maintain a certain thickness at the blade, you end up with an edge bevel that's at most like a chisel and might be as much as 90 degrees at the edge. So you're not going to be able to cut through any kind of clothing. You're not, in a functional sense, you're not going to be able to cut, okay? And that's even true of certain other types of sword. For example, an estoc. I think most people would agree that most types of estoc or concierge, the Polish version, they are square section blades. They are thrusting lance-like implements. You can bash someone with them, absolutely. You can do the motion of a cut, but you're not going to technically cut. You will just smash someone quite hard, like with a crowbar. I think you'll agree crowbars don't cut. Now, the funny thing is, when we come to rapiers, there are certain types of rapier which are termed rapiers that, would I call them a rapier? I'm not really sure because rapier is such a vague term, that 100% can cut and can cut quite well. So I've recently received two swords for testing and review from LK Chen. One of them is this rapier. Now I was quite surprised because on screen I had not appreciated how broad this rapier was, and I would say that in no sense is this a typical rapier. It's almost like what I would call a scaled up side sword. Yes, it has a swept hilt of a, well, kind of Italian-German design, continental design. It's actually a type of swept hilt that we find all over Europe. But the blade, as you'll see, is, for a rapier, really quite broad. And because it's quite broad and relatively thin up here, yes, indeed, we have hella good edges up here, and that is gonna, I mean, you'll be able to remove digits, forearms, chop into necks, into parts, through clothing, parts of people's bodies, and into legs and stuff like that with this type of blade. It is absolutely an effective cutter. And when, I mean, I don't know if you can hear that on camera, but this thing cuts like a giant scaled up kind of side sword, I guess, or possibly even arming sword. And the blade on this, I think, will cut the equal of certain types of sabre, and as I say, broadsword, backsword, things like this, better than most padroons. So this is absolutely, yes. Is it a rapier? I don't know. So some people might call this a military rapier. So to answer that question, what is a military rapier? Well, what people tend to refer to as a military rapier is a rapier of very robust proportions. However, this isn't a period term, and it also contains within it a misconception, and that is that for a rapier to be carried in war, it has to be particularly beefy. Now, we could argue about whether there is a correlation between beefier rapiers and rapiers that were carried in war and sometimes even worn with armour. That's another thing. Don't think that armour wasn't worn at this time. It absolutely was. People wore very often breastplates and a helmet, and sometimes even full half armours. Sometimes cuirassiers wore full armour. So in the age of the rapier, armour was still worn. It's just that most sword soldiers weren't wearing very much armour. Even in war, most soldiers were only wearing something like a buff coat or a breastplate and a helmet, so they weren't wearing all-encasing armour, and therefore swords like this are still very useful because you can still hit someone in or thrust someone in the face, you can still chop them in the leg or chop them in the arm, and you're still going to have the desired effect because there's no armour there. But military rapier is a term which has been applied to particularly large, heavy and chunky rapiers, but as I say, it's not at all a period term. And also I think there's a misconception there, because we absolutely know that there are narrow and slender rapiers that were carried in war. So just because a rapier is big and chunky doesn't mean it's a war rapier. It can just be someone's everyday carry rapier. And just because a rapier is particularly slender and long and narrow and light doesn't mean it's just a civilian dueling rapier. It can be carried in war, because we know examples that belong to famous people that were carried in war, and they're slender in some cases and light. So, military rapier is a term that usually applies to big and chunky rapiers, but it's not correct, and it contains all sorts of misconceptions, and you probably shouldn't use that term, even though I have been known to use it occasionally myself as well to sort of make a point. Problems with all kinds of communication. Anyway, this is a broad rapier of a type that is not a typical rapier. It's almost like a scaled up side sword, and absolutely will cleave and chop all day long, and I'm looking forward to testing this because I think it'll cut very well. And finally, we have another type of sword. This is, we've previously looked at Windlass's Town Guard, Munich Town Guard type sword here, based on a group of swords that were made. I think there's about 100 and 120, something like that, known surviving examples that were made for the Town Guard of the city of Munich in Germany, München, and in Bavaria. And those survive in fairly large numbers. There's some variation between them. They're not all identical, but they are of a type. They're roughly similar lengths and widths and proportions and weights and stuff like this. But they do have some variation, because just like sword makers today, when you make 100 or 200 or 300 of an object, there's going to be some variation between them. That's even true with HEMA practice weapons. So this is LK Chen's rendition. Now, funnily enough, Windlass didn't get everything right at all with reproducing that type of sword. LK Chen haven't exactly either, but they've both got slightly different things, better or worse, in terms of replicating the originals. But this is nevertheless a very nice sword, and it's representative of a type of sword that was popular around the year 1590 to 1610, so either side of 1600. The Munich Town Guard swords date to about 1600, if I remember correctly. So this, what is this? Is it a rapier? Well, I think most people would say it's not long enough. So the blades tend to only be 30-31 inches. So by most people's criteria, that's way too short for a rapier. And if I just put it next to my antique English rapier for a second, you can just see the proportions are really quite different. It's a lot shorter, but apart from being a lot shorter, it's also broader. And actually, if we just isolate the blade, if you ignore the hilt for a second, the hilt is a swept hilt. If you ignore the hilt and just look at the blade, it's a medieval arming sword. So really what these were, and these continued in use, don't just think that like rapiers supplanted everything that went before. The fact is that arming sword blades continued in use on what we now call side swords, again not a period correct term, and they stayed in use on what we would commonly regard as a rapier hilt. So just because something's got a hilt that looks like that, do we call it a rapier? Personally, I wouldn't. If I was explaining this to one of my HEMA friends, I would probably describe this as a side sword. Although it's got a particularly developed swept hilt of a type of the Elizabethan period, the blade functionally is the same as the type of sword you might find on, you know, a sword from Henry V's time used at the Battle of Agincourt. There's no real functional difference. So can this cut? Of course it can cut. It's just like a medieval arming sword. It just has later period and better hand protection on it. So, is this a military rapier? Well, some people would call this a military rapier. Personally, I wouldn't. I would call this, because I don't really like that term, I would call this a late side sword, probably. And bear in mind that side sword method, even if we accept that side sword is not a period historical term, side sword method, particularly associated with the Bolognese, but certain other Italian masters, and you could say certain, like Mayer's rapier is more like side sword than what we classically call rapier, is something that continues into the 1600s, and you could even say it's related to some of the English backsword stuff and things like silver. So just because certain types of rapier fencing, what we now call rapier fencing, came in, doesn't mean that older styles of weapon use disappeared. And we know that Marozzo, for example, continued to be printed and continued to be a popular source, despite the fact it was originally printed in 1536, was still being studied and cited in 1600. Okay, so fundamentally, is this a military sword? I think by virtue of the fact in this case we know the provenance. Okay, so we know that this was specifically for town guard soldiers. So this is a military sword with essentially a good protective hilt, that you might find that kind of hilt on a civilian sword, if there is such a thing. And so yes, this is a military sword. Is it a military rapier? I'd say not. I'd just call it a sword. So we come back to my friend David Rawlings' take on it here. They're all swords. So to summarise, what's a military rapier? A military rapier is really nothing, unless we can specifically, as in the case of the Munich sword, say, well, that is a rapier that was made for the military. But really, a military rapier doesn't get us any closer to any description of a sword, unless it's purely between friends and they understand what they mean. In other words, it's pure communication. I refer to a military rapier because it's a chunky rapier. Not a great description, but there we go. Can rapiers cut? Yep, a lot of rapiers can cut fantastically. Some rapiers can really cut really well, but are they rapiers? Or is this what Swetnam would have called a long sword? I would argue it is, because if we look at Joseph Swetnam from 1617, he refers to some long one-handed swords as long swords, and he refers to some of them as rapiers. What did he mean? I suspect in English language he meant a rapier was a particularly narrow sword that had diminished cutting capacity, and this was probably what he'd refer to as a long sword, that is a sword that has good cutting capacity. So this is a particularly broad rapier. And then, you know, my antique example here is fairly typical of lots of rapiers. It has some cutting capacity, but it's never going to be a great cutter except for very specific targets and very specific usages. It's really almost a dedicated thruster. And please don't go too far in saying that all rapiers can cut, even though most rapier treatises have cutting actions in them, because there are rapiers that absolutely do sometimes have blades that cannot cut at all. I mean, you can bash someone, as I say, you can whip someone with one, but you're not really going to cut. Oh, and I almost forgot. So I said I was going to mention long swords, and here we go. So here I've got one of the Royal Armouries windlass line that I did with the Royal Armouries and windlass. And this is a relatively narrow, it's not even the narrowest longsword you'll find, but it's a pretty narrow, dedicated I would say, armoured fighting longsword with a pretty narrow blade. And just to put this into context, I'm going to put that next to my antique rapier here, and you will see, yes indeed, it's for the most part broader at the cutting portion of the blade. Remember, we're cutting with this region up here. It is broader and certainly thicker and stiffer and heavier than my rapier here. However, if I now move over to the LK Chen rapier here, the rapier is significantly broader than the longsword. Now it's also thinner, so this blade is actually has got quite a lot of heft to it, and if you hit something hard with this, it will have a lot of effect on the target. Not so that this won't, but in a different way. So this edge is significantly narrower, but it's also thicker. It's therefore, the edge geometry is completely different, and if you look at the rapier blade here, this will actually pass through soft targets and flesh and stuff like that far easier than this will. And I think that might surprise some people out there, that longswords are sometimes narrower at the centre of percussion than some so-called rapiers are. Hope that's useful. Hope I'll see you back on the channel soon, and take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.